This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about writing with your end in mind. We were just saying between pressing record, ending one and starting the next, that gosh, we don't know how pantsers do it. How do you launch a 300-page journey without knowing where you're going to end up? So what are the pros and the cons of knowing your climax? And how does that help you in the very beginning developmental stages?
Well, what a great episode this was.
I wasn't even expecting that. I should have been.
Sorry for you listening. The pros are that you're automatically given a through line, so your creativity is going to be automatically channeled, I think, by default. And I'm a great believer in restrictions drive creativity, so I don't enjoy pantsing for that reason, because it's too loose for me. However, having said that, I don't outline in major detail. It's really just no more than bullet points that relate to significant story elements. So, I clearly like the creative aspect of going from, I tend to call them stage markers, going from one stage marker to another. But I can see that for some people, knowing how the story ends robs them of the thrill of penning the word, and which we all get, I think, anyway, when you're drafting, when something comes to you, you think, oh, that is freaking brilliant, I've got to use that. Then go back and read it for revision, you think, yeah, sure.
And that gets changed.
Yeah. May have to just shift that a little bit, but the flashes of inspiration come to us, and I like the idea that there's a guiding light that I'm aiming towards that helps drive those flashes of inspiration. And it gives me something to then use as foreshadowing. When in our episode on agency, we're talking about building agency or building skill sets or building psychological change in the character. And I think if you know where you're heading, that helps. Right.
I think foreshadowing, what you said about foreshadowing, Robert, is a really great point to bring home. There's so much that you have to set up as you're writing for what's going to come down the road. And some of that you can do as you go. You're writing this scene and you think, oh yeah, this detail, I'm going to, play it out later, or it's going to come back, or there's going to be an echo there. But if you don't know those markers along the way, and ultimately the beacon at the climax, then there's a lot you might have to just rely on backfilling later.
I don't think I've ever written a story without starting with the climax. I think that's usually the germ of the idea for me. Even if I start with a character or a snippet, by the time that I've thought more than 30 or 45 seconds about it, it's really about where they've gotten to that fascinates me. It's not about where they started. So I very rarely start with a beginning. I guess it's that triumphant mountain moment that I get the vision of first, and then it's okay, now how do I work backwards to get there rather than the other way around?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because so many of our things in life we don't easily start with the end in mind. And if you read a lot of personal development or self-help non-fiction, Stephen Covey, I think, is famous for it, starting with the end in mind. He even goes so far as to say, I want you to imagine you're giving the eulogy at your own funeral, which sounds a bit dark, but actually it's a very interesting exercise. And we don't often do it. We're used to starting at beginnings and kind of muddling our way through. So maybe it's not a natural thing to do, but I like your idea, Kathryn, of seeking the triumphant moment. And again, we're not necessarily talking about the Hollywood ending triumphant moment. We're talking about what is that experiential moment that the character goes through.
Right.
Like in that other episode where we were talking about, the character got a bullet going through their brain, sorry to bring back the grisly imagery, and it still meant something. It was a moment of revelation. So whether it's revelation, triumphant, discordant, failure, it is a moment that we're aiming that story toward.
Right. What you said about a eulogy.
Yeah.
It is eulogy. Yeah. Yes, it is emotional. What you said about the eulogy, Robert, is so interesting. It made me think, well, if I wrote my eulogy, then I would be afraid of disappointing myself. What if my life's journey doesn't live up to the things I aspire to have said in my eulogy? And then that made me think of what we're talking about, was starting with the climax, and we as writers need to know that ultimate outcome, but our protagonist can't know it. So it connects back to the last episode we did on agency very well. And I've kind of been thinking of a lighthouse. You know how some writers, I think Stephen King might have said this first or earlier, that it's like driving a car on a dark night and you can't see beyond your headlights, so you're only... But what if you've got a lighthouse and you're out at sea on your ship and the sky is dark and you don't know where the rocks are and you don't know where the shoals are and you don't know how high the waves are going to be, but you still have that lighthouse, you have that beacon that you're heading towards. So knowing your climax, or at least the ending you're aiming for, doesn't diminish the process of discovery and the journey of writing, but you can certainly have a chart or plant some buoys in the bay or something to help you get to that lighthouse.
I'm not entirely sure that lighthouses are there so that ships actually go to them.
Well, that is true. They're there to keep you away from them, but well, it's kind of a mixed metaphor. You're right.
Stands.
The image, yes, thank you, Kathryn. The imagery stands.
From a story's point of view, it's fabulous because you actually want the main character to think this lighthouse they've got to get to, but if they do, they're going to be dragged over the rocks. So
even better. See, perfect, because what else happens in a climax, right? We damage our protagonist.
Yeah.
Poor guys.
No, I would find it very difficult to write without having some sense of how this is meant to finish up. And I'm a bit like Kathryn, I don't necessarily need to know how that happens for the protagonist, just that there is that moment. And usually for me it's quite mechanical. I know what the plot element is that has to happen for that. And then that can really frustrate me for the middle section of the book, though, because I know where they need to get to, I just want to keep shortcutting it the whole time.
Yeah, it can lead to really lean writing because you just go boom, 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 boom. That's how we got there.
Yeah.
Not in my works.
And this is why you're the master there, Alida.
Or why I write the longer novels. I don't know.
I mean, I will say that I also do it from a scene and a scene chapter act point of view as well. I'll have where I want to get to.
Yes.
When it wants to get more into the weeds in drafting, I do find it hard even to write completely into the void of, even if I just know where the end of the overall story is. I need each section to I know where I need to get to. And again, that's enforced restrictions on creativity that it's quite fun. You know, you can have a puzzle. You know, how do I get from here to there without making it seem ridiculously obvious to the reader, so that by the time they get there, they go, "Oh, yeah, I should have seen that," but they didn't. You know, and
right. Well, and often we do even as readers, both as writers and as readers, we do know what the climax has to be, at least in a general sense. That's why we say it should be inevitable, but surprising. So you know Harry's going to face off with Voldemort. You know the Karate Kid is going to win the karate match. You know that Luke is going to face Darth Vader. You know the lovers have to get together. You know, right? So we do know it's going to be a sword fight or a magic duel or a karate match or a race against time or whatever the genre and the specific story establish in the opening scene in terms of setting, abilities, conflict, what kind of world we're entering. So then as writers, we have to determine the specifics and then also the journey. So part of that, as you were saying, Robert, writing with restrictions encourages more creativity. So then the fun becomes, how do I make the inevitable surprising? How do I make this journey worthwhile for me, for my characters, and ultimately for my readers? What's going to make it different from every other, epic battle or ships crossing in the night or whatever type of story you're writing? Are you ready to take your writing to the next level? Could you use the help of a developmental editor or writing coach? I work with writers at all skill levels and all stages of the writing process, both through project-based developmental editing packages and one-on-one, totally customized coaching sessions. Head over to wordessential.com/editing to see how I can help you grow your storycraft and become a more knowledgeable, skillful, exciting writer.
Also, that conclusion and the ending of your story should really denote what genre you're writing it. Because ultimately, as you said, Alida, the reader is expecting a certain sense of satisfaction. We were talking off air about why we read the same story in it, over and over again, with twists perhaps, but we're after a similar experience. Just as when I order a really hot Indian curry, and I don't expect to get something that's a weak stir fry,
mashed potatoes.
So, right, exactly. So you know what you're expecting to get, but there'll be something in there that just delights you this time around. I love that okra that they put in there, or it's something different but the same. And I think that is why we read the similar type of story over and over. That's why genres are so successful, because when you buy a police procedural, you're not expecting that it ends with the romance of the sudden romance of a couple. You say, no, I want the police procedural to be solved. Right. Equally, if you're buying a romance, unless it's labelled as a romantic thriller or romantic suspense, you don't expect there to be ridiculous dark danger in there. So I think by starting with that end in mind, it should help you answer the very first question: is what genre am I writing in here? Which will then determine the important points with that you're going to put your creativity to use on, and it will stop that traveling salesman coming in at the last minute and killing off the preacher.
We hope so. We certainly hope so.
But we just don't want that to happen.
Right. So when you start with your ending, how much do you need to know? I mean, if it's a romance, the lovers get together. If it's a mystery, the detective solves the case. But our job is to create a unique version of this timeless form. So, Kathryn, you said you've never written a story without knowing the ending and that's what inspires you. So how much specificity do you begin with?
I definitely go beyond genre. It's not just, okay, so my character needs to win the epic battle at the end, or he must be the mage who conquers this or whatever. Like, usually I have a very specific thing that inspires the whole of it. So I don't know, like, for example, this little short story that I just wrote to try and get myself to start writing again. The prompt that I was given by a friend was a soldier who is usually loyal, but something happens, and that was the whole prompt. And my immediate thought was, he goes to save his brother, and his brother refuses to be saved. That's the ending. And I was like, okay,
ooh, that's a good one.
So it's very specific,
mm-hmm.
but it also follows the genre considerations as, it's a little fantasy story. It's in my world. He's a soldier, so I got the sword, and I've got the magic aspect, and I've got an army, but it's all medieval army, and all this stuff. But what inspired me was the very specific, not the genre specifications, but the very specific moment of, this is what he was trying to achieve, and his brother thwarted it, and that's what he has to overcome at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Boom. So it's very, very specific. That's usually what happens in my brain, and then I have to work it backwards.
Mm-hmm.
Figure out, how does that happen?
Right.
Why did that happen? When, and then that kind of specificity is what's inspiring to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't want just, they won the battle. It doesn't get my brain going.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I were in your shoes, I would see that as a starting off point. Okay, his brother refused to be saved, and now my hero must therefore become, right, a renegade, right, journeying,
him, showing up, and his brother's like, no, and then him just taking off, and I was like, that's it, that's the climax, that's his moment to have his victory. So I guess it's kind of like the very beginning of the climax. Mm-hmm. For me, but that's where I saw my character's completion of his journey. He had to make that decision right there to become the person that would finish that story. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's right before the ending point for him.
Yeah.
But for me, that was the launch into the climax, and then that is what made me so excited to go back and write the story. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think it brings up a really good craft tip for everybody, that when you understand what's at stake for your hero in that climax, for this example, to save his brother, then you know a lot about his motivation, what is driving his journey up to that climax, what's going to, keep him making those choices, overcoming those obstacles, facing those consequences that build up to the climax.
Right, and it gives him a reasonable motivation to sacrifice Lot. He can go big because everyone's going to kind of understand that family emotional tie. So it gives me the opportunity to really go for it, which is fun.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. Specifics. Very specific moment between a character and their emotional drive, and that's what inspired that whole thing.
I love that. How about you, Robert? Are you very specific in your climax details?
Yeah, I think so. I think similar sort of thing. It's definitely scene based, and don't necessarily know how it plays. So it might be that, again, similar. Might be right at the start of the climactic moment. I know what needs to happen. Don't necessarily know how they resolve it yet. But it's definitely something that. I think I've learned to make it big. I think in my early days of writing, I was fearful of writing big, and I think that I've heard this before, that people don't feel confident enough in their writing to write something that's jagged enough to get into a reader's heart. And I think that's why we read, isn't it? We want that breathtaking moment at some point in the story, and then certainly obviously lends itself towards the ending, where you've finished a book and you put it down and you can't read another book for a little while, because it would ruin the feeling you've just had. Like my meal analogy again, you're completely satisfied with what you ordered, and no, I don't need anything else now. Even to have a dessert would ruin it, just to savor these tastes. So I think part of it is it's very visual, But there is a sense of satisfaction in there, but I don't know how the satisfaction is necessarily achieved. But I do have some very specific ideas about the scene and what they're facing. So it sounds a little similar to Kathryn's.
Yeah.
What about you, Alida? Do you find yourself starting with the end like that?
I think it really depends on the story I'm writing. With some of them, like with the mysteries, I know I've got to get to a certain type of climax to satisfy the story. You know, so with the murder in Ska Hall, I knew it was going to have to do with the scene of the crime that happened 40 years ago, and that my protagonist, psychic detective, is going to have to kind of enter the ghost victim's death experience. That was how I was going to make it big. So it was closely tied to the setting and to this trauma that is old but being lived in the now by the protagonist. And you know, the payoff is going to be not only solving the crime, but also healing the past. And it had to put my protagonist in real physical danger, so it isn't just like a mental, emotional experience, like a flashback. She has to sort of enter the experience bodily and actually, you know, be strangled, so that's part of the paranormal aspect of it. And I think if I didn't have any one of those elements, it wouldn't have been fully satisfying, because you need the physical danger, you need the emotional tension, you need the connections to the setting and to the genre. The book I'm working on right now, I know how it ends very clearly, but I don't know that I suppose there are a number of climaxes because the book is told in 4 parts. And so instead of building up to one giant climax, it's sort of like the stage of life and of the novel has this big event, and then we transition, and then there's this big event. And, you know, it's more of an epic journey, but not in the fantasy sense where you need all sorts of characters to come together in a battle. It's a personal, historical life journey. So we'll see what I end up writing as a climax. That's really interesting, because I hadn't sat down and thought about this piece of the story specifically. I've been working toward the end that will satisfy the reader, but not in the sense of a peak conflict followed by a quick resolution.
What do we say then to the writers who love writing into the dark, or people who would consider themselves pantsers, and maybe even don't like the idea of having, because it sounds like we all do enjoy having some kind of end in life. And I would sense that there's clearly a bulk, portion of authors who do that, but there was also a not insignificant portion who just write, and whether we call them pantsers or people who do write creatively without knowing where their story is taking them. And Stephen King specifically gives this guidance in on writing, where he says it's like carving a rock. Your job as an artist is to carve away what's already there and expose what's underneath. So, but without knowing that, and then Dean Wesley Smith says writing into the dark is the best way to write, or not the best, but is a powerful way to write. I've struggled with it, but do people who write that way, who employ their creativity that way, do we think that they have an unconscious idea of what the ending is, and they're using the process to uncover that? How does that work? I mean, it baffles me. I don't know how I can do it.
Well, I think there's obviously going to be a spectrum and kind of best case and worst case scenarios for that process. And the worst case scenario is that you are truly just taking stabs in the dark, and you're going to end up with tangents, with sloppy structure, with a ton of revision and backfilling to do. And best case scenario is that you've got it all in your head, and so you're able to do the structural work as you're putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard. And so, if you're a genre writer where those markers you need to hit along the way, you've got heavy reader expectations, you've got inherent structure built into what you're writing, you probably can internalize most of that. And so you develop your characters, you establish your situation and your setting, and then you go and you see what happens because it's already built in for you. I like kind of the happy medium where I do a ton of discovery writing where I'm playing around in the dark in my journal, and then I do my storyboard, which sets up my markers. But then I think you're both similar writers where within that structure that we establish for ourselves, we've got room to grow and play and discover and explore. But we end up with less revision work, hopefully.
Yeah.
Because we've done the groundwork.
Right. Work at the front, work at the back. I think it depends on what kind of writer you are in terms of how you work best, right? So if work at the back is the way that you like to do it, and you like coming back in and seating in the details and going back and doing foreshadowing and fixing structural problems, like
True.
Go for it. And that may be where you really shine. Like you love just sitting down and banging out something that's completely new, and then you shine in the revision. Like, more power to you.
Right.
I don't understand it, but more power to you.
And I have said to Stephen, he does need to work on his endings. So, there is that.
So over coffee, you and Stephen were sitting down and...
Totally.
Said,
well, why didn't you invite us, Robert?
He said, what do you think? I said, look, it rambled for 800 pages. It was pretty good. But the ending, wasn't particularly surprising. It certainly wasn't inevitable. So, do better next time, please.
I'm glad you're setting him on the right path. It's about time. Oh, goodness. Any other thoughts? Well, there you go. I think we've come to an inevitable ending. Not sure it's surprising, but... Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.